The first time I realized food could be memory was when I was 7 years old. My Nonna stood me on a wooden stool in her kitchen in Providence, Rhode Island, her hands veined and spotted with age, guiding mine through the ritual of kneading dough. "Marco," she'd say in her thick Italian accent, "you must feel the pasta with your heart, not your hands." I didn't understand then, but I felt it. Something passing from her calloused fingers into my small ones. Something older than both of us. 7 years ago, I walked into Salt and Stone, a struggling restaurant in the coastal Maine town of Harborview. The owner, George, a retired naval officer who'd sunk his pension into a failing business, took one look at my resume and said, "You're overqualified, son." I told him I wasn't interested in his resume judgment. I was interested in his kitchen. There was something about the bones of that place, a renovated 19th century shipbuilder's home with exposed beams that reminded me of the rafters in my grandparents' first American home. I could feel my grandmother there somehow. "Give me 6 months," I told George. "If I can't turn this place around, I'll walk away, and you won't owe me anything beyond my basic salary." He laughed, but he handed me the keys. What I created in that kitchen wasn't revolutionary or trendy. I simply cooked the way my grandmother taught me, with intention, with history, with respect for ingredients. I took her Ligurian recipes and married them with Maine's bounty. Lobster ravioli with brown butter that tasted like the sea in my childhood at once. Seafood stew that made people close their eyes when they took their first bite. The kind of silence that falls over a table when food transcends sustenance. Within a year we had lines out the door. By year 3, you couldn't get a reservation less than 2 months out. Food critics from Boston and New York made the pilgrimage, writing about the authenticity of flavor and soulful cooking that defies trends. But the critics weren't why I did it. I did it for the locals who came weekly, who brought their families, who celebrated anniversaries and birthdays with us. I did it for Mrs. Lawrence, a widow who came every Tuesday for the seafood stew, who once clutched my hand and said, "This tastes like memory." I did it for my team, Danielle, my sous chef who'd followed me from 3 restaurants before, who knew what I needed before I asked, Sophia, whose pastry work complemented my savory dishes like they were composed together, Adrian, who'd started as a dishwasher and now ran the line better than chefs with twice his experience. They weren't employees, they were family. And I needed that family. My own had fractured the day I told my father I was dropping out of architectural school to attend Culinary Institute. "Cooking is what we did to survive in Italy," he'd said, his voice cold, "not what we came to America to do." He didn't speak to me for years after that. Some nights, after service, I'd sit alone at the bar, running my fingers over the worn wood, sipping bourbon, feeling a sense of home I hadn't felt since those afternoons in my grandmother's kitchen. I belonged there, until I didn't. George sold the restaurant 4 years ago when his wife needed expensive medical treatments. The new owner seemed fine. Distant investors who were happy with our profits and smart enough to leave us alone. Then, 6 months ago, everything changed. Rebecca Hamilton walked in, a portfolio of papers under her arm, designer heels clicking on our hardwood floors. "I'm your new owner," she announced to the staff. "And I have big plans for Salt and Stone." Rebecca had made her money in tech and was looking for her next project. She'd never worked in restaurants before but spoke with the confidence of someone who believed excellence was transferable across all industries. The first changes were subtle. She'd bring friends in during service, disrupting the kitchen flow for photo opportunities. She'd question my plating, saying it wasn't Instagrammable enough. She'd suggest we source out-of-season ingredients because they'd quote, pop more in photos. "People eat with their eyes first," she'd insist. "They eat with their memories first," I'd counter, but she'd already be walking away, phone to her ear. I tried to adapt. I adjusted presentations while maintaining flavors. I tolerated the photo shoots and the consultants who traipsed through my kitchen talking about concept and brand positioning. But then I overheard her one night thinking I'd already left. "We'll keep the name for now," she was saying into her phone, "but everything else changes. New concept, new chef, new energy." My stomach dropped, but I kept cooking. I thought 7 years of success, of full reservations and devoted customers, would speak for itself. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon, same as any other, when Rebecca called me into her office. "Your menu is too traditional for where we want to take this restaurant," she said, barely looking up from her laptop. "We're going in a different direction." 7 years. 7 years of early mornings at fish markets, selecting the best catch. 7 years of late nights perfecting recipes. 7 years of building relationships with local farmers, foragers, and fishermen. 7 years of pouring my soul into every dish that left my kitchen. All dismissed in a single sentence. "When would you like my last day to be?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Friday would be good. We'll pay you through the end of the month." She finally looked up, offering what I'm sure she thought was a generous concession. "We'd like you to leave your recipes, of course." Of course. My grandmother's recipes, my life's work, my soul on plates. I just nodded. What else could I do? I spent my last 3 days documenting everything. But recipes are just roadmaps. They don't capture the journey. I didn't include the way I knew it was time to pull the seafood stew when the aroma shifted from oceanic to earthy. I didn't note how the pasta dough should feel alive under your fingers before it's ready. Those things couldn't be written down anyway. On my last night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the kitchen that had been my world. I touched every surface, memorized every smell, and silently said goodbye. The next morning I packed my knives while Daniel watched in disbelief. "Those are your recipes, your soul in this place," he insisted. I just shrugged. Not anymore. Walking to my car one final time I felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out everything that defined me and left an empty shell. Have you ever had something precious taken from you by someone who didn't understand its value? That hollow feeling of watching someone hold your heart in their hands without recognizing what it is? If so, give this video a like and subscribe. Because what I learned is that sometimes, the story doesn't end with loss. Sometimes, that's just the beginning. The weeks after leaving Salt and Stone were the darkest of my life. My apartment, which had always just been a place to sleep between kitchen shifts, suddenly felt like a prison. I couldn't bear to cook. The thought of chopping an onion, of smelling garlic hitting hot oil, activities that had once been as natural as breathing, now brought waves of grief, so intense I could barely stand. I ordered takeout and let it go cold on my coffee table. I avoided driving past the restaurant. Friends called. I let it go to voicemail. Daniel texted updates I pretended not to see. Rebecca had brought in Andrew, a chef known for molecular gastronomy and trendy techniques. He was recreating my menu items but adding, quote, "modern flair." My seafood stew now came with foam. My handmade pasta replaced with versions cut into precise geometric shapes. The food looked impressive on Instagram. It photographed beautifully. And gradually, the calls from Daniel changed. Customers were complaining. Mrs. Lawrence had sent back her seafood stew twice, saying it tasted, quote, empty. Reservations were declining. Rebecca was growing increasingly frantic, changing menu items weekly, chasing trends rather than understanding what had made the restaurant special in the first place. 6 weeks after my departure, my phone rang with Rebecca's number. I let it go to voicemail. The message offered triple my former salary for, quote, consultation. I deleted it. 3 days later, she was at my door, offering an ownership stake. "The restaurant is struggling without you," she admitted. "We need your perspective." What she meant was, I've leveraged everything to buy this restaurant, based on its reputation, your reputation, and now I'm watching my investment crumble. I shut the door without answering. That night I couldn't sleep. I drove to the old part of town, to a building I'd inherited but rarely visited, my grandfather's market, closed for decades now. I unlocked the heavy door, dust motes dancing in the beam of my flashlight. The shelves where he'd once stocked imported olive oils and wheels of cheese stood empty. The marble counter where he'd sliced prosciutto was still there, cracked but solid. I ran my hands along the walls, feeling the history there. And for the first time since leaving Salt and Stone, I felt something stir inside me. If you've been through dark times where everything that once brought you joy seems hollow, you know how powerful that first spark of interest can be. That moment when something inside whispers, maybe, just maybe. Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. The next morning I called a contractor. 2 days later, I was standing in the empty market with plans spread across the dusty counter. "Nonna's table," I said to no one in particular, testing how the name felt in my mouth. Not trendy, not marketable, just true. While renovations began on the market building, I rented a small storefront across the street. Nothing fancy, just a counter, some tables, and a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people. I put a simple sign in the window. Nonna's table, opening soon. No website. No social media campaign. No press release. I started cooking again, simple things at first. Bread. Pasta. Sauces that simmered all day, filling the tiny space with aromas that drew people in from the street. "What are you making?" they'd ask, poking their heads in the door. "Memories," I'd answer. The market wasn't ready, but I couldn't wait. I opened the storefront with a handwritten menu of just 5 items. Within days, there was a line down the block. Daniel left Salt and Stone to join me, then Sophia, then Adrian. The tiny kitchen couldn't hold us all, so we worked in shifts, passing one another like dancers in a choreographed routine. Mrs. Lawrence came on our 3rd day open. She took one bite of the seafood stew, and tears filled her eyes. "I've been looking for you," she said. Word spread. Not through Instagram or influencer campaigns, but the old way, person to person, heart to heart. They came because the food spoke to something in them that couldn't be captured in a photo. Rebecca sent a cease and desist letter, claiming I was violating non-compete clauses in my contract. My cousin Michael, an attorney, proved Nonna's table was a different concept entirely. "You can't claim ownership of authenticity," he told her. Salt and Stone struggled on, changing concepts repeatedly. Farm to table 1 month, Asian fusion the next, then Nordic minimalism. Nothing stuck because nothing was real. 6 months after I opened the storefront, we moved into the renovated market. The night before our grand opening, I was alone, setting up the last details, when the bell over the door jingled. "We're not open until tomorrow," I called out, not looking up from the table I was arranging. "I know," said a voice I hadn't heard in nearly a decade. I wanted to be first in line. My father stood there, older than I remembered, more gray than black in his hair now, but unmistakable. In his hands was a weathered book I recognized instantly, my grandmother's handwritten recipe collection. "She always said you were the one who understood," he said, holding it out to me. I was too proud to see it. 1 year after opening Nonna's table, we had expanded to take over 2 adjacent storefronts. Salt and Stone closed permanently. Rebecca moved back to tech, wiser perhaps about the difference between trends and tradition. More importantly, every Sunday night, my father joined us for dinner at the restaurant, sometimes bringing old photographs of the market in its heyday, sometimes just his appetite and his stories. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me had ultimately led me home, to my true cooking, to my family heritage, and finally, to a reconciliation I never thought possible. Tonight, after service, I sit alone at the bar, the same marble counter from my grandfather's market, restored and polished now. I run my fingers over the surface, feeling the slight dips and imperfections that speak of history, of use, of life lived fully. I realize now that Rebecca did me a favor, though not the one she intended. In trying to take everything from me, she forced me to rediscover what was truly mine, not a job or a restaurant, but a legacy, a voice, a way of speaking through food that was authentic to my soul. Sometimes the deepest betrayals lead us back to our authentic selves. What has betrayal taught you? Share your story of finding strength after betrayal in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more stories of heartbreak, healing, and truth. Food is memory, it's history, it's family. Now each dish I serve carries not just my grandmother's legacy, but my own journey through loss and rediscovery. Each plate that leaves my kitchen is an invitation to taste not just ingredients, but authenticity. And in a world increasingly obsessed with appearances, with what photographs well rather than what nourishes deeply, that may be the most revolutionary act of all.